Among the ashes of Alexandria linger scrolls the world was never meant to read. Welcome to Echo Slumber. I am your host. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Let's begin. Beneath the shifting sands of Egypt, there lingers a story older than many empires, older even than the dreams of the pharaohs. The Library of Alexandria, that shimmering jewel of human thought, once held words and wisdom gathered from the furthest reaches of the known world. Yet among its countless scrolls, there were whispers of texts so dangerous, so powerful, they were hidden from even the most trusted scholars. These were said to be the forbidden scrolls, writings that could change the course of nations, reveal truths long buried, and unlock the quiet, unsettling corners of the human mind. Tonight, we will drift through marble halls and ink-stained chambers, breathing in the dust of vanished civilizations, and perhaps catch the faintest echo of those lost words. You are safe here, wrapped in the comfort of curiosity, guided through history's soft candlelight. We truly love and care for you, and this is your moment to rest within the folds of the past. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now, grab your coffee and let's get started. The city did not appear as a sudden miracle, though from a distance it seemed so, as if the gods had dropped a fragment of Olympus into the waters of the Mediterranean. Alexandria's white colonnades rose from the harbour, gleaming under the Egyptian sun, their reflection shimmering in the restless tide. Ships from every corner of the known world docked in its busy port, slender Phoenician traders with hulls painted in reds and blues, broad Egyptian grain vessels carrying the lifeblood of empires, and swift Greek triremes gliding in like silver fish. The scent of salt and spices mingled in the air, cinnamon from the east, incense from Arabia, and the heavier perfume of lotus oil drifting from the markets. It was a city built at the meeting place of three worlds, Africa, Asia, and Europe, and its streets were as varied as its ships. Sailors haggled with philosophers, and merchants brushed past robed astronomers as they argued about the movement of planets. The language of trade was a blend of tongues, sometimes Greek, sometimes Egyptian, sometimes an untranslatable mix that only those who lived here could understand. Every alley seemed to carry a story. Every corner hummed with the electricity of exchange. At the heart of this city stood the Great Library, not merely a building, but a statement of ambition. Ptolemy II, heir to Alexander's dream, envisioned Alexandria as the intellectual capital of the world. The library was to be its crown, a place where all knowledge would converge, copied, preserved, and studied. Messengers were sent far and wide to collect texts, from the poetry of Homer to the treatises of Indian mathematicians, from Egyptian medical papyri to Phoenician navigation charts. Ships that arrived in Alexandria were searched not only for goods, but for books. Any scrolls found were taken, copied in the library's scriptoria, and the copies returned to their owners. The originals, always the originals, remained in Alexandria. The building itself was a sanctuary of thought. Its halls were cooled by marble floors and shaded by high latticed windows that let in soft, diffused light. Shelves of cedar and cypress reached to the ceilings, and the air was filled with the dry, faintly sweet smell of papyrus. Scholars from distant lands walked in its corridors, their robes brushing the stone, speaking in low, reverent tones. Some came to read ancient wisdom, others came to challenge it. Every day the rooms echoed with debates on philosophy, astronomy, medicine, and history, the voices rising like birdsong in the morning. But there was another side to the library, less spoken of and rarely acknowledged. For all its openness to the gathering of knowledge, there were scrolls that could not be read by just anyone. In the deepest chambers, behind locked bronze doors, lay the restricted collection. Few knew exactly what it contained, and fewer still had permission to see it. These were the writings that carried danger as well as illumination, texts whose content could disrupt governments, unseat religious authority, or reveal truths too unsettling for the world beyond those walls. The keepers of these scrolls were a quiet brotherhood, chosen not only for their intellect, but for their discretion. They moved like shadows among the scholars, never calling attention to themselves. When they handled these forbidden works, they did so with an almost ritual reverence, gloved hands, measured steps, the weight of centuries resting in their palms. Some said that to read these texts was to invite a kind of haunting, for once such knowledge entered the mind, it could not be set aside. Not all the works hidden away were dangerous in the obvious sense. Some were merely disruptive. There were scrolls that told histories from the perspective of conquered peoples rather than their conquerors, shattering the official versions taught in schools. There were treatises on medicine that spoke of cures beyond the reach of local healers, threatening the power of established guilds. There were astronomical charts that placed the sun, not the earth, at the centre of the heavens, a thought that could unsettle entire systems of belief. Outside the library's great bronze doors, Alexandria bustled and roared, a city too alive to concern itself with the quiet dangers in its midst. Fishermen called to one another across the harbour. The markets rang with the sound of hammered bronze and shouted bargains, and from the Pharos lighthouse, the tallest in the known world, the light swept across the waves to guide ships into safe waters. But for those who stepped inside the library, time seemed to slow, and the din of the city faded to a whisper. In here, the treasures were not gold or spices, but words that could heal, destroy, or transform. It is said that if you stood in the library's great central hall and closed your eyes, you could hear not only the scratching of styluses on parchment, but the soft rustle of ideas passing from mind to mind. And if you listened carefully, more carefully than most dared, you might catch another sound, fainter still. The click of a lock turning deep within the archives, where knowledge slept in guarded darkness, waiting for the rare moment when someone deemed worthy would bring it into the light. That was Alexandria, a city where the world met, and where the world's greatest secrets were kept hidden in plain sight. A place where every sunrise brought a ship with new stories, and every sunset saw them tucked safely away, some into the hands of eager scholars, others into the shadows where they would not be seen again for centuries. And even now, as we drift through the memory of its marble streets, we might imagine those locked rooms still exist somewhere, their shelves heavy with truths too dangerous to tell. They were known simply as the Keepers, a title without flourish, without hierarchy, for to them the work mattered more than the man. They came from many lands, their mother tongues different, their robes stitched in patterns as varied as the winds that brought them to Alexandria. Yet once inside the marble embrace of the library, they became alike in one defining way. They had sworn the oath. It was not an oath spoken before a crowd or marked by trumpets, but a quiet, deliberate binding of self to duty, whispered in the presence of the head archivist beneath the shadowed dome of the restricted hall. By lamplight, the words were intoned in Greek, then repeated in the keeper's own native speech, sealing it not only in the mind but in the heart. The oath was both simple and impossible. To guard the knowledge entrusted here, to share it only when the world is ready, and to defend it against all destruction, even the destruction of truth. In this final clause lay the paradox, for sometimes the protection of a truth meant ensuring it was never known. The keeper's days were not marked by the bustle that filled the outer halls. They moved in the soft-lit archive rooms, where the air was cooler and heavy with the scent of aged papyrus and beeswax. Their sandals made no sound on the polished stone floors. They carried keys of bronze that hung at their waists, each one inscribed with patterns known only to them, patterns that corresponded to locks deep within the restricted vaults. To see a keeper pause before a sealed chamber, fitting key to lock, was to watch a ritual, not a task. Training for the role began long before the oath itself. Those chosen were often apprentices who had shown an unusual mind, not merely clever, but patient, resistant to the intoxication of power that knowledge could bring. They were taught not just languages and histories, but how to read danger. This skill was subtle, for danger in the library was rarely a matter of sword or flame. It lived in the turn of a phrase that undermined the faith of a nation, in a calculation that could unleash new forms of destruction, in a prophecy that once believed might shape the actions of kings. To recognize such dangers, the keepers learned the signs. They studied the ink itself, its pigments, the mineral flecks that revealed it came from distant lands. They read for symbols hidden between lines, for double meanings veiled in poetry, for metaphors that masked heresy. Theirs was a kind of reading that peeled back the skin of a text to reveal the bones beneath. When they found such a work, the decision was not theirs alone. A small council of senior keepers convened in a chamber without windows, each seated at a triangular table, so that no single man sat at the head. There they weighed the scroll's potential harm against its worth. If deemed too dangerous, it was moved to the inner vault, a place even most scholars did not know existed. These vaults were carved into the very foundation of the library, their doors bound with layered bronze, their hinges kept oiled in silence. Life as a keeper demanded sacrifice. They could not discuss their work, even with family. To speak of what they had read, even to hint at it, was to risk exile from Alexandria and the destruction of the very scrolls they guarded. Many chose to live alone in the city, their homes as sparse as their duties were heavy. The streets bustled with the laughter of merchants, the debates of philosophers, the cries of fishermen hauling in their catch, but the keepers carried a quieter rhythm within them, one that pulsed to the turning of pages and the slow breath of candlelight. It was said that the greatest danger to the library was not the fire that could consume it, but the human hunger for forbidden knowledge. Once a dangerous truth is released, it cannot be recalled. It spreads, reshapes, and breeds consequences its discoverer may never foresee. The oath, then, was not a chain but a shield, and the keepers stood behind it, guarding not only the scrolls but, in their own way, the balance of the world beyond Alexandria's walls. On rare occasions, a keeper faced a test unlike any other, to decide whether a truth long kept must finally be shared. This might come when a plague swept through the city, and the only known cure lay in a hidden medical text, or when a ruler sought a prophecy to justify a war. In such moments, the keeper bore the full weight of his oath, knowing that either choice, to reveal or to conceal, might alter the fate of nations. To outsiders, they were merely librarians with a penchant for solitude, but those who watched closely might notice the way a keeper's gaze lingered on certain scrolls, or the faint hesitation before he locked a door. They lived in constant awareness of the fragile boundary between enlightenment and chaos. In their hands, the past was not just memory, it was power, and power could never be left unguarded. And so the keepers continued their silent patrol, moving like shadows in the lamplight, bound not by chains, but by words spoken once in a quiet chamber. Words that shaped their lives and guarded the heart of the library. Words that, even now, seem to echo through the corridors of time. Some truths must sleep until the world can wake without fear. It began, as many of the library's deepest secrets did, not with a grand discovery, but with a whisper. The keepers had long known of a small bundle of scrolls kept in the inner vault, wrapped in linen darkened by centuries and sealed with a lump of black resin. They were not written in the clean, orderly hand of Greek philosophers or the flowing curves of Egyptian scribes, but in an older script, one no keeper could entirely place, though fragments of its shapes could be found carved into the oldest temple stones of Mesopotamia. The scrolls spoke of the first flame, not a fire of wood or oil, not the sun, not even the celestial fire of the stars, but something older still. They described an origin not born of chaos, as Hesiod and other poets sang, but of will. The universe, according to these writings, was lit by a conscious spark, a living fire that breathed the laws of existence into being. From it came not only matter and light, but the patterns by which matter and light would forever behave. It was a vision of creation that sidestepped the gods entirely, not denying them, but placing them as later actors upon a stage already set. The flame, said the scrolls, did not vanish after its first breath. It smouldered still, unseen, in the heart of every star, in the heat of every life, waiting to be recognized. To read these words was to feel the boundaries of myth and reality blur, to wonder if the stories of every culture were not variations on a deeper truth. For the temples and priesthoods of Alexandria's many faiths, such an idea was dangerous. If creation came from a living spark rather than a divine decree, what then of the authority of the gods? What of the rituals, the offerings, the carefully maintained hierarchies of priests and supplicants? The keepers knew the answer. Such words could unravel the web of power on which the city, and perhaps all cities, depended. The origin of the scrolls was uncertain. Some claimed they were brought by a caravan from the east, their guardians killed in a skirmish on the desert roads. Others whispered they had been taken from a temple deep in Nubia, hidden under the false floor of a burial chamber. A few insisted they were older than both tales, salvaged from the ruins of a city that had stood before the flood stories of half the world. The truth lay buried under centuries of retelling, as elusive as the high flame itself. The scrolls were written not as myth but as record. They contained diagrams of spirals and radiating lines, mathematical ratios whose elegance hinted at something more than poetry. A passage described the breathing of the flame, an expansion and contraction over unimaginable spans of time, shaping the rhythm of the cosmos. Another spoke of sparks that know themselves, a phrase some keepers believed was a veiled description of human consciousness, as if the flame had planted in us the ability to remember its own birth. A few keepers, those who had read deeply, found themselves changed in ways they could not quite name. Some withdrew further into solitude, as though the knowledge had made the world outside feel smaller. Others grew quietly restless, sensing that the patterns described in the scrolls were not confined to the past but were still unfolding, still guiding events in ways unseen. Yet the danger was not only in the philosophy. Among the more cryptic sections were instructions, or perhaps allegories, for calling forth the flame in the present. These spoke of mirrors polished to the brilliance of ice, of aligning them so that the light of certain stars met in a single point. They spoke of heat drawn not from fire, but from the bending of invisible threads in the air. Whether these were metaphors for meditation or the bones of some forgotten science, the keepers did not know. What they did know was that the very attempt to follow such steps could inspire movements, cults, and upheavals. Thus the scrolls remained locked away. Only a handful of keepers, in any generation, were permitted to read them, and even then, only once. The texts were then returned to their wrappings, sealed again with resin, and placed on a shelf whose location was memorized, but never written down. In the ledgers of the library, they did not exist. Still, the whispers escaped. A philosopher exiled from Athens hinted in his surviving letters at a fire that thinks. A priest from Cyprus spoke in parable of a light that lit itself. These fragments, scattered across the centuries, were dismissed as curiosities. But in the quiet of the library's vault, the keepers knew their source. Sometimes, late at night, one could imagine the inner vault itself breathing, as if the scrolls were not mere objects but embers, their warmth dulled but not gone. And in that stillness, a keeper might wonder if the flame was not waiting to be discovered, but waiting to be remembered, and whether when it was, the world would be remade. The map lay flat beneath a sheet of translucent linen, its colours muted by time, its edges frayed as if it had been unrolled and rolled again by countless careful hands. To the untrained eye, it was a work of strange cartographic beauty, swirls of ochre and pale green for land, deep blues for oceans, and delicate lines marking what seemed to be rivers and mountain ranges. But to those who had studied it, the real strangeness lay not in its artistry, but in its refusal to remain the same. It was said that the map to nowhere had no fixed geography. A keeper might study it in the quiet of early morning and see one arrangement of land and sea, then return by lamplight that evening to find the shapes transformed. Continents shifted, shrinking or swelling, islands vanished entirely, rivers bent into new courses. The changes were not random, they followed a slow, deliberate logic, as though the map were revealing the earth through the lens of time itself. Some scholars believed it was a record of the world, as it had been millions of years before human memory. The coastlines of vanished continents, the mountain ranges worn down to gentle hills, the oceans swollen or shrunken beyond recognition. Others argued that it was not only the past the map displayed, but the deep future, shorelines drawn back by retreating seas, valleys carved by rivers yet to be born. The idea unsettled many, for it suggested that the world's shape was not permanent, but in constant, restless transformation. No one knew how such a thing could be made. The pigments used were unlike any in Alexandria's stores, their colours richer yet softer, as if they held the light differently. The parchment itself was tougher than papyrus, smoother than vellum, and seemed to resist the brittleness of age. Touching it directly was forbidden. Keepers handled it only with the thinnest of gloves, for fear that the warmth of a hand might coax another change in its form. The first known mention of the map came from a logbook in the library's earliest years. It recorded the arrival of a merchant ship from the southern seas, bearing spices, ivory, and a rolled chart wrapped in seals of gold leaf. The captain claimed it had been part of a temple treasure in a city long claimed by the ocean. How it came into his possession was a matter he avoided answering, and the library's scribes wisely chose not to ask further. When the map was first unrolled, it inspired awe. Scholars from many lands gathered to debate its meaning. Was it a forgotten record of exploration? An attempt by some ancient mind to imagine the world beyond its own horizon? Or, as a few whispered, was it not made by human hands at all? Those whispers grew louder when a geometer from Rhodes compared the map's changing shapes to the shifting positions of the stars and tides. He claimed that the map's transformations matched cycles far longer than a human life, suggesting a knowledge of time measured in thousands of years. His findings never left the inner vault. The keepers feared that if such an artifact became widely known, it would not be seen as a curiosity of science, but as a tool of prophecy. And prophecy, in the wrong hands, could reorder kingdoms. To look upon the map was to feel one's own smallness. The familiar outlines of Egypt and the Mediterranean were absent, replaced by unfamiliar seas and unnamed lands. Mountains rose where deserts now stretched. Forests covered places where cities stood. A keeper once described the sensation as walking into a room of mirrors, each one showing the earth in a different lifetime, none of which belonged to us. It became the practice of the keepers to view the map sparingly. Too long a gaze seemed to leave an imprint on the mind, a lingering sense that the ground beneath one's feet was not as solid as it seemed. Some reported dreams in which they stood on cliffs overlooking oceans that had not yet formed, or walked through cities that had long since turned to dust. The map's greatest mystery was its centre, a small faint mark shaped like a spiral, no larger than the curl of a shell. It never moved, no matter how the continents shifted around it. Some thought it marked the birthplace of life, others the meeting point of all ley lines, others still a place that existed outside of time entirely. None could say for certain, for no known geography matched it. In the end, the map to nowhere was named for the impossibility of fixing its truth. It could not guide a traveller to any port, nor could it be used to claim lands. What it offered instead was a humbling reminder that the earth we know is but one moment in a story written over eons, a story whose pages turn whether we see them or not. And so it remained in the vault, its shifting coastlines sleeping in the half-light, watched over by those who understood that some knowledge does not need to be used to be powerful. It only needs to be remembered and guarded. The chest was unremarkable to the casual eye. Cedar darkened by age, its corners worn smooth, its surface carrying the faint scent of resin that lingered like the ghost of an orchard long vanished. Yet those who knew the vault's inventory understood what rested within. A single folded letter, its papyrus browned with centuries, its ink still sharp as if written yesterday. This was the last work of Timaeus of Phaleron, a philosopher who once lectured beneath the painted colonnades of Athens. His voice, according to those who had heard him, was calm and measured, yet his questions could unseat the certainties of even the most devout. He had not been driven from his city for denying the gods. That was too crude a charge for a man of his subtlety. No, his exile came because he dared to ask aloud whether divine law, handed down through the mouths of priests, was any more just than the shifting decrees of kings and councils. The letter, addressed to a fellow philosopher whose name the centuries have since erased, was written in the weeks before Timaeus was escorted from Athens under armed watch. It began without bitterness, even with a kind of weary affection for the city he could no longer call home. But soon the tone shifted, as though the ink itself grew heavier under the weight of the thoughts it carried. Men, he wrote, build temples not to worship the gods, but to worship the certainty that the gods are on their side. They call divine that which favours their cause, and condemn as impious that which challenges it. What then is the difference between the will of a god and the will of a ruler, save the name by which we address it? To read those lines was to feel the tremor of something dangerous, not because they dismissed the gods, but because they stripped away the aura of inevitability that religion bestowed on human law. If the decrees of men and gods could be weighed on the same scales, what power could claim to be absolute? The letter went further still. Timaeus questioned the justice of the gods in the myths themselves, pointing to tales where divine beings acted from jealousy, spite, or vanity. If such conduct would shame a mortal, he asked, should it not also shame the immortal? Or is power its own absolution? Such words in the wrong ears could dissolve the glue that bound a city together. Athens exiled him quietly, without public trial, sending him eastward on a merchant vessel under the pretext of ensuring his safety. His possessions were confiscated, save for a small satchel in which the letter was hidden, sealed with wax and resin to protect it from the salt air. How it passed from his hands to Alexandria's library is unknown, perhaps traded by the ship's captain to a Ptolemaic official, perhaps surrendered by Timaeus himself, when he realized he would not live to finish his argument. The keepers who handled it did so with an odd mixture of reverence and caution. They knew the power of words that did not demand belief, but instead demanded examination. The letter was stored not in the open stacks, where students and visiting scholars might stumble upon it, but in a narrow niche behind the inner vault's northern wall. Only those with a key to the cedar chest could read it, and even then the reading was done in a small bare chamber with no ink or stylus allowed, to ensure no copy could be made. It is said that one keeper, upon reading the letter, left the library for good, travelling into the desert with nothing but a water skin and a walking staff. Others returned to their duties unchanged in manner, but quieter in voice, as if the letter had seeded in them a question they dared not speak aloud. For the rulers of Alexandria, the danger was not in the content alone, but in its author. Timaeus had been respected, even admired. His banishment had not erased his influence. Were his words to spread through the city, a city already alive with debates in its lecture halls and markets? They might ignite a fire of doubt that no temple decree could extinguish. And so the letter remained sealed in its chest, a voice silenced by distance, yet still echoing across centuries for those few allowed to hear it. The resin preserved more than papyrus. It preserved a challenge to the very foundations of power, waiting for an age that might dare to answer it. Sometimes a keeper would pause before the cedar chest as if listening for something. The faint scratch of a pen, the murmured rhythm of thought. Perhaps they wondered if the philosopher, wherever he walked in his exile, had imagined a future where his words would outlive both the gods and the kings he questioned. They arrived in Alexandria quietly, without the fanfare that often accompanied gifts for the library. No gilded chests, no ceremonial procession through the market streets. Instead, they were carried in the hold of a broad-decked vessel from the eastern seas, wrapped in oilcloth to guard them from salt and moisture, nestled between crates of pepper, sandalwood, and carved ivory. The merchant who brought them was not a scholar, but he knew their worth. He had been paid to deliver them directly into the hands of the Ptolemaic scribes, bypassing the open docks entirely. When the keepers unwrapped the bundle in the lamplight of the receiving chamber, they found 12 scrolls, each inscribed in a flowing, unfamiliar script. The characters were unlike the Greek letters that lined most of the library's shelves, or the hieroglyphs carved into the city's temples. These were smaller, more intricate, almost as if drawn with a brush rather than a stylus, the ink deep and glossy like obsidian. The parchment itself was not papyrus, but a material so fine and durable it seemed to hum faintly under the fingertips. Through translators, careful deliberate work over months, the keepers came to understand what they held. The scrolls contained a vast compendium of medicinal knowledge. Descriptions of plants that did not grow in Egypt, minerals found only in distant mountains, and methods of surgery that had no parallel in the Mediterranean world. There were treatments for fevers that killed in days, for wounds thought incurable, for ailments that had plagued the streets of Alexandria for generations. One scroll described the preparation of a bitter infusion from the bark of a tree whose blossoms closed at nightfall, said to halt the progress of a wasting disease that thinned the bodies of the young. Another detailed a powder, ground from a mineral vein in lands beyond the Indus, which could soothe the inflammation of the lungs in those struggling for breath. There were instructions for setting bones not merely with splints, but with precise pressure to ensure they healed straight and strong. And there were drawings, delicate, precise, of the human body's interior, its organs rendered with a clarity that startled even the most experienced Greek physicians. Yet as the keepers read further, the awe deepened into unease. For each remedy, there was a shadow, a darker use hidden within the same knowledge. The same bark that cured the wasting disease, when steeped longer and in greater concentration, became a poison that shut down the heart in minutes. The mineral powder that eased breathing could, if prepared differently, paralyze the muscles until a man suffocated in silence. Even the surgical techniques carried danger. The skill to mend a body could just as easily be turned to end it with precision. It was this duality that troubled the council of senior keepers. The scrolls offered salvation and destruction in equal measure, their power resting not in the materials themselves, but in the mind that used them. To make such knowledge widely available would be to invite its misuse, whether by assassins, ambitious generals, or rulers seeking new ways to punish enemies. Yet to lock it away entirely was to deny the city cures that could save thousands. The council debated for weeks in the dim, echoing chamber of judgment. Some argued that knowledge, by its nature, should not be hidden, that the choice of good or harm lay with those who held it. Others countered that human history had proven too often that harm came first and faster. In the end, they chose the path of caution. The scrolls were catalogued under false titles in the outer registers, trade accounts from the Eastern Isles, botanical observations of foreign lands, so that no curious scholar searching the shelves would suspect their true contents. The originals were placed deep in the vault, in a compartment sealed by 3 separate locks, each key held by a different keeper. Access would be granted only under the most urgent circumstances, and even then, under direct supervision. Still, the presence of the scrolls cast a quiet influence over the library. There were moments, late at night, when a keeper copying an unrelated manuscript might pause, his mind drifting to the cures sleeping in darkness below his feet. Outside, the streets of Alexandria teemed with life, merchants crying out their wares, children darting between market stalls, priests chanting in the temple courts. And among them, the sick moved slowly, coughing in the dust, their faces pale under the sun. The knowledge to heal them was here, in this building, yet sealed away by the very hands sworn to protect it. Some keepers wrestled with the weight of that choice. A few carried the guilt quietly until the end of their lives. One, it was whispered, broke his oath in a moment of compassion, slipping a recipe for a fever cure to a physician he trusted. Whether this saved lives or merely spread the danger further, no record tells. In the centuries since, the scrolls have never been seen outside the vault, but there are faint echoes, treatments described in far-off lands that resemble those hidden in Alexandria, suggesting that perhaps the knowledge found its way into the world, after all, in fragments carried by memory and word of mouth. For the keepers, the lesson was one they already knew, but could never escape, that every remedy holds its poison, and every poison its remedy. To guard one is to guard the other, and to release either is to gamble with the shape of the world to come. The scroll was unlike most in the libraries' vaults, for it was as much picture as text. Unrolled across a long cedar table, it revealed a sequence of illustrations so intricate that even the most experienced copyists hesitated to touch them. The ink shimmered faintly in the lamplight, as though it had absorbed the glow of 100 dawns, and the parchment was reinforced with a thin backing of woven fibre to keep it from tearing under its own length. Its origin was uncertain. Some thought it had come from the workshops of a forgotten inventor in the Greek Isles, others that it was a relic of the East, carried on monsoon winds to Alexandria. A few, whispering in the corners of the vault, dared to suggest it was older still, salvaged from a civilization whose ruins now lay under shifting sands. Whatever its source, the scroll's contents stirred both wonder and unease in equal measure. It described machines meant to fly, not in metaphor, not as mythic chariots of the gods, but as devices constructed by human hands. The first drawings showed long, narrow frames of polished metal, fitted with articulated wings that could tilt and fold. A network of cables connected the wings to a central seat, where the pilot, by shifting his weight and pulling levers, could mimic the motions of a bird. The notes alongside spoke of catching the breath of the wind and bending it to lift the frame. Further along, the designs grew more ambitious. There were sketches of great chambers, shaped like inverted teardrops, built from a lattice of light metal and covered in thin, impermeable fabric. Beneath each chamber was a small furnace intended to heat the air within and make it rise. The accompanying text described climbing the invisible ladders, a poetic phrase, yet one that hinted at principles of buoyancy far ahead of their time. Most remarkable were the depictions of craft that combined both wind and steam. A diagram showed a cylindrical boiler mounted in the centre of a vessel with fixed wings. The steam would power a set of rotating blades, which in turn could push the craft forward, even in still air. Another design paired sails, curved and angled in unusual ways, with metal frames that seemed intended to stabilise the craft against the buffeting of the wind. To the keepers who examined it, the possibilities were staggering and troubling. For if men could master the air, they could cross mountains in a single day, descend upon cities without warning, and strike where no army could march. The scroll did not speak of war directly, but its implications were clear. To command the skies was to command the shape of power itself. Some keepers argued the scroll was allegorical, its machines symbols for philosophical ideas, the wings representing ambition, the heated chambers, the rising of the human spirit. But those who studied the proportions in the drawings, the careful notations of weight, balance and angle, doubted this. The precision was too great, the mechanical reasoning too sound to be mere metaphor. In a rare session, the council debated whether the scroll should be destroyed. The idea of obliterating any text, however dangerous, was nearly unthinkable in Alexandria's halls. Yet the fear was real. If such designs fell into the hands of a ruler eager for conquest, they could change the course of nations. In the end, destruction was rejected, not from mercy, but from caution. The scroll's ideas, once burned, could never be recalled, and if some fragment of the design survived elsewhere, it would be beyond the keeper's ability to judge or control. Better, they decided, to keep the original sealed away, guarded and unseen. Only a handful of men in each generation were permitted to unroll it, and even then, they did so in the presence of others, so that no single mind could carry its secrets unchallenged. There were strict rules: no copies, no sketches, no measurements committed to memory without oversight. The scroll was to be studied only for the purpose of understanding the breadth of human thought, never for application. Yet, as with all such restrictions, temptation lingered. There were stories, unverifiable but persistent, of a young keeper who traced the shape of the wing frames onto his sleeve in charcoal, then vanished from Alexandria within the month. Another tale told of a visiting scholar from Rhodes who, upon catching sight of the scroll through an open vault door, returned home and began work on a small glider. Whether these stories were truth or cautionary invention, the keepers never said. At times, when the vault was still and the air heavy with the scent of cedar and dust, a keeper might linger over the scroll a moment longer than necessary, eyes tracing the lines of those impossible machines. In the quiet, he might imagine the rush of air against his face, the world spread out below him in silent miniature, the horizon stretching farther than any ship could sail. And then he would roll the parchment up again, sealing the vision away, knowing that some dreams are too vast to be unleashed before their time. The Pharos lighthouse stood like a pillar between worlds, its base rooted in the solid stone of Pharos Island, its crown brushing the winds of the open sea. By day, its fire guided ships toward Alexandria's harbour. By night, it became something else entirely for those who knew how to climb its winding stairs after sundown. To an astronomer named Callisthenes of Cyrene, it was the finest observatory in the known world. From the upper platform, the view was unbroken in all directions. The sea stretched black and silver under the moon, and the city lay behind him like a scatter of faint embers. Above, the sky opened vast and absolute. Callisthenes had been granted permission to use the tower by a sympathetic harbour official, though the true extent of his work was kept quiet. The priests of Alexandria's temples had no quarrel with ordinary stargazing, but the records he kept, those were another matter entirely. For years, Callisthenes charted the heavens with a precision few thought possible. Using an array of bronze instruments, armillary spheres, sighting tubes, and weighted plumb lines, he measured the positions of the stars not just night by night, but year by year, noting how they shifted against the black tapestry of the sky. He kept meticulous tables, recording the path of the moon across seasons, the slow crawl of certain bright points that wandered differently from the fixed constellations. It was during one of these long vigils that he first noticed a pattern in the movements of the moon and sun. Comparing his records to those of earlier observers, he predicted not just the next eclipse, but the one after that, years in advance. When the first prediction came to pass precisely on the hour he had marked, word began to spread quietly among the city's scholars. By the time the second arrived, exactly as foretold, the whispers had reached the temples. The priests were uneasy. Eclipses had always belonged to the gods, omens to be read by those appointed to interpret the divine will. For a man to claim he could calculate them by measuring shadows and angles was to suggest that the heavens were not ruled by caprice, but by laws. And if there were laws, then perhaps the gods themselves were bound by them. Callisthenes' work went further still. By comparing the apparent sizes of the sun and moon during different phases, and by studying the curvature of the Earth's shadow as it fell across the moon during an eclipse. He made bold calculations about the shape of the universe. He argued that the Earth was not the center of all things, but a sphere moving through a vast space, with the sun at its heart. It was a vision that inverted the familiar order, one that would strip both priests and kings of their role as intermediaries between the heavens and humankind. The reaction was swift, though not public. A delegation from the temple sought him out under the guise of honoring his work. They listened politely to his explanations, then reminded him that some truths, if spoken too loudly, could undo the harmony of the city. Callisthenes understood their warning and ignored it. That night, he returned to the lighthouse to refine his measurements, certain that the pursuit of knowledge was worth any risk. But the risk was not his alone to bear. The library, always alert to the shifting balance between wisdom and danger, soon became involved. The keepers summoned Callisthenes to present his findings in the innermost hall. They examined his charts, his tables, his sketches of the planetary paths. None could fault his mathematics. The numbers were as sound as the marble beneath their feet, and that was precisely the problem. If released, these calculations could fracture the city's fragile alignment of belief and power. What priest could command reverence if the sun, not the earth, was shown to be the true center? What ruler could claim the mandate of the gods if those gods no longer moved the heavens at will? The keepers decided, reluctantly, to act as the city's unseen governors of truth. They requested the scrolls and tables for preservation, promising Callisthenes they would be copied and shared in time. The originals were taken to the vault and locked in a narrow cedar case marked only with a code known to 3 men. No copy was ever made. Callisthenes himself was not silenced outright, but he found the doors of the lighthouse closed to him, the harbour official replaced, and his instruments confiscated. He continued his work from a modest rooftop in the city, but without the horizon and clarity of the pharaohs, his precision faded. In time, his name slipped quietly from the conversations of scholars, remembered only in the sealed ledgers of the library. Still, the keepers could not help but wonder what might have happened had his work been allowed to circulate. Would the city have crumbled under the weight of such a revelation? Or would it have risen to meet a new, truer vision of the universe? In the lamplight of the vault, the sealed cedar case seemed almost to hum with the unanswered question. And perhaps, somewhere in the unseen currents above the city, the heavens themselves carried on in their silent, lawful dance, indifferent to whether anyone watched or not. It was stored differently from the other treasures of the vault, not in a chest or sealed cylinder, but laid flat beneath a pane of polished quartz, as though the very air might damage it. The parchment was long and narrow, its surface darkened to the colour of old ivory, the edges faintly curled despite the care of centuries. To look at it from a distance, one might think it merely a list, a tidy arrangement of names written in a steady, unhurried hand. But those who had permission to study it knew it was no ordinary record. The scroll of 10,000 names did not speak of anyone living. Each name belonged to someone long dead, many so ancient that their lifetimes lay far beyond the reach of recorded history. The names were not arranged in the order of dynasties or cities, nor grouped by the rise and fall of kingdoms. Instead, they formed a single, unbroken chain, one name followed by another, then another, each connected by a small mark that meant born of. The chain stretched back past the pharaohs, past the earliest kings of Mesopotamia, past even the shadowy rulers mentioned only in legend. At the scroll's beginning were the names of men and women who had lived within memory of the empires now crumbling. But as the list moved backward, the language shifted, first to Older Greek, then to Egyptian hieratic, then to scripts that only a few keepers could decipher. And still it went on, the names more alien in form, their origins tied to places no longer found on any map. The scroll's end, or perhaps its true beginning, lay in a single line, written in a hand different from the rest. It named a man said to be the first of all, belonging to a tribe that dwelled by the River of Beginnings. The description of this river did not match the Nile, nor the Euphrates, nor any known waterway. Its banks were said to be lined with trees of silver bark and leaves that shone pale in moonlight, its waters running warm even in the coldest season. No such place was known to exist, at least not in the age of the library. For the keepers, the implications were profound. If the scroll was genuine, and its meticulous script, consistent genealogical links, and layers of linguistic evolution suggested it was, then it placed all of humanity's nations within the same ancestry. Greeks, Egyptians, Persians, Nubians, Indians, all were threads from the same root. In a city built upon the pride of empires, this was a truth that could cut in any number of directions. Some would see it as a unifying revelation, dissolving the boundaries drawn by conquest and trade. Others, especially rulers who claimed divine descent, would see it as a threat, stripping them of the uniqueness that gave their authority weight. To admit that a king and a common fisherman shared the same ancient blood would be to upend centuries of hierarchy. Because of this, the scroll was never placed in the open archives. Even within the vault, it was treated with a particular caution. The number of keepers permitted to view it could be counted on one hand, and each was required to take an additional oath, not just of secrecy, but of deliberate forgetfulness. They were to commit nothing from the scroll to memory in full, only fragments sufficient for cataloguing. Whether this was truly possible, the keepers themselves sometimes doubted. The origins of the scroll were obscure. One tradition held that it was a gift from a caravan master returning from lands beyond the Caspian, offered in exchange for safe passage through Ptolemaic territories. Another claimed it had been stolen from the treasury of a forgotten kingdom, smuggled to Alexandria by sailors who had no idea of its value. Yet another suggested it had always been here, inherited from the very earliest collections, its survival a matter of luck and the foresight of unnamed guardians. There was one peculiar detail the keepers noted but never explained. In the first third of the scroll, written between two ancient names, there appeared a faint mark shaped like a water drop. It was not part of the script, nor was it a flaw in the parchment. Some thought it a scribe symbol for a birth at the river itself. Others considered it an accident, the remnant of a drop of ink. But there were a few who believed it was a signature, a way for the scroll's original maker to leave his mark without claiming credit. Whatever its true meaning, the scroll of 10,000 names remained one of the vault's most carefully guarded artifacts. The keepers understood that it carried not just historical weight but the power to redefine the stories nations told about themselves. In the wrong hands, it could be twisted into justification for conquest, proof that all lands were one's rightful inheritance. In the right hands, it could dissolve the lines between conqueror and conquered entirely. For now, it lay beneath its pane of quartz, untouched except for the rare times a keeper was granted the privilege of turning it over to inspect the reverse. Those who had done so swore that the back was blank, yet somehow warmer to the touch than the air around it, as though the names themselves still lived in some way. And perhaps they did, for names, once written, have a way of surviving far beyond the bodies they belong to. It was kept in a narrow drawer of the vault, away from the others, as though even proximity to ordinary works might disturb them. The keepers called it the Inverted Codex, though no one knew its true name. Unlike most of the library's treasures, it was bound not as a scroll, but as a series of thin, polished plates hinged together, each inscribed with lines of compact script. The writing, at first glance, seemed ordinary enough. A tight, neat hand, the ink a deep brown that caught a reddish gleam under lamplight. It was only when one tried to read it that the strangeness began. Every word was reversed, not simply in spelling but in placement, so that the first line on the first plate was, in fact, the last to be read. To follow the text, the reader had to begin at the back and move steadily toward the front, eyes tracing sentences in reverse order. their meaning assembling only after the mind had passed over them. Even so, this was merely the surface of its inversion. The true difficulty lay in its logic. Where most writings moved from cause to effect, the Codex began with the consequence and unravelled its way to the reason. A chapter might open with a man standing in an empty house, his hands bloodied, and only by reading backward would the reader understand that he had not committed a murder, but delivered a newborn in the dark. Events collapsed into one another like reflections in a series of mirrors, the outcome preceding the choice, the revelation preceding the question. Those who attempted to read it in full found their minds subtly altered. At first, the change was no more than a discomfort, as though the thoughts themselves were being tugged against the current. But as the days passed, they began to dream in reverse, remembering the endings of dreams before their beginnings. They described walking through the city and sensing the echoes of events yet to happen. A shout before the quarrel, the scent of bread before it was baked. Some keepers suspected that the Codex was a kind of training device, meant to teach the mind to think along paths usually closed to it. Others feared it was more than that, a deliberate attempt to reshape perception itself, to loosen the ordinary grip of time and sequence. The origins of the work were unknown, though a faint inscription on the inside of the back cover suggested it had passed through at least 4 different hands before arriving in Alexandria. One of these was a scholar from the mountains east of the Black Sea, known for his studies in cryptic poetry. Another was a priest astronomer, whose temple had been abandoned after a series of strange predictions came true in the wrong order. Whether they were its authors or merely its caretakers, no one could say. It was also unclear whether the Codex contained a single narrative or a series of unrelated pieces. The shifting logic made it difficult to tell where one ended and another began, and some readers claimed that on a second attempt, passages seemed to have altered, not in wording, but in meaning. A sentence that once read as an account of a battle might now appear to be a meditation on the growth of a tree. For this reason, the keepers approached it with extreme caution. They allowed only one reading per individual, and then only under supervision. The reader was required to spend a day in isolation afterward, both to recover from the mental strain and to allow the keepers to observe any changes. Most emerged shaken but unharmed. A few refused to speak of what they had read, their eyes lingering on unseen shapes in the air. One, it was whispered, left the library entirely, claiming he had seen the last page of the world. Some argued the Codex was an elaborate puzzle, a demonstration of intellectual virtuosity meant to amuse or challenge its readers. But others, especially among the older keepers, held that it was not entertainment, but a key, though to what door and in which direction it opened remained a mystery. Whatever its purpose, the inverted Codex remained one of the vault's most troubling possessions. To remove it from its drawer was to feel a faint coolness radiating from the plates, as if the air around them moved differently. When it was returned, the keepers always checked the hinges, ensuring it was closed tight, as though some part of its logic might spill out if left open too long. Even now, it waits in its quiet compartment, unread for years at a time, its sentences lined up like steps taken backward into a place where beginnings and endings trade places without warning. And perhaps for those who have held it, the world never quite returns to its original shape, for once you have learned to walk in reverse, you cannot help but glance behind you for the future. It was bound in oil-dark leather, its edges warped by salt, its pages thick with the faint scent of the open sea. The mariner's log was not a grand scroll meant for display, but a working book, the kind kept close to the chest, written in a hand both hurried and careful, the ink pressed deep by a pen that had travelled through storms. Even before the keepers translated it, they could feel in its weight that it was no ordinary sailor's account. The first entries were familiar enough. Charts of wind and current, descriptions of trading ports, notes on the cargo taken aboard. The mariner, whose name appeared only once, Dorymenos of Thera, had sailed far beyond the pillars of Heracles into waters the Alexandrian cartographers considered the edge of the known world. His crew traded for amber, salt and the pelts of great sea animals. They bartered with coastal villages whose names had no place in Greek or Egyptian tongues. Yet beyond these practical matters there was a second voice in the log, a more reflective one, that hinted at something the mariner was reluctant to record too openly. It began with a sighting on the western horizon, a shape like the crown of a hill, yet it moves upon the sea. The crew, thinking it an island, altered course. As they drew closer, they saw not a hill but towers, white against the setting sun, rising from a low coastline. The city, Dorymenos wrote, sat upon the water's edge, as if placed there by the hands of giants, its walls smooth as polished shell, its streets laid in precise, gleaming lines. They anchored offshore, for the harbour was strange, too still, without the scent of fish or the clutter of smaller boats. The mariner wrote of silence, broken only by the sound of the tide against the hull. No smoke rose from the city, though faint lights flickered in its towers as night fell. What happened next filled the remaining pages in a hand grown unsteady. He described the first tremor as a shiver in the deep, strong enough to set the rigging humming. The water withdrew suddenly from the shore, bearing stretches of seabed where strange shells lay glistening. Then came the roar, not of wind, but of the sea itself. A wall of water rose beyond the harbour, higher than the tallest mast, higher than the towers upon the land. It moved with impossible speed, the moonlight breaking upon its crest like silver shards. The waves struck the city with a sound like 1,000 amphorae shattering, and the towers crumpled as though made of clay. The streets disappeared beneath the surge, the lights winked out. The crew, anchored well offshore, could only watch as the city vanished in the space of minutes. When the water receded, there was nothing but foam and floating debris, shards of white stone, splinters of wood, the bodies of birds that had nested in the city's heights. In the days that followed, Dorymenos and his crew sailed the area, seeking survivors. They found none. The seabed where the city had stood was now a deep, swirling channel, its currents so strong that nets cast there were torn away. On the second day, they recovered a single object, a tablet of pale stone, etched with a script none of them recognized, its edges worn smooth as if it had passed through many hands before the sea claimed it. The log ended weeks later, upon the crew's return to safer waters. Dorymenos admitted he could not speak of the city to the traders and officials who asked about his voyage. They would call it a dream or a drunken tale, he wrote, and perhaps they would be right. Yet I have never seen the sea so still before a storm, nor so angry after. The keepers, upon reading the translated log, debated its truth. Some saw in it the familiar outlines of seafaring legend, a drowned city, a sudden wave, a warning from the deep. Others pointed to the details, the precision of the city's construction, the unrecognizable script, the unnatural stillness of the harbour. Could this have been a fragment of a civilization older than Egypt, older even than Sumer, one that vanished in a single night? If it was true, then the mariner's account was not merely a story, but the last witness to a chapter of human history erased by the sea. And if it was myth, it was one told with such conviction that its bones might still hide a truth. For often the oldest myths are those draped over the shape of a real event. The log now rests in the vault, its leather covers still faintly smelling of salt. The stone tablet, stored beside it, remains untranslated, despite years of quiet study. Some keepers believe the two must never be separated, as though the tablet itself is a key to the memory of that lost city, a reminder that the sea does not always return what it takes. And in the long nights when storms batter Alexandria's own harbour, the keepers sometimes imagine that far out beyond the horizon, under black waves and shifting sands, the white towers still stand, silent, waiting, their streets echoing only with the sound of the tide. They appeared at first as ordinary scrolls, the kind any merchant or minor scribe might carry, their papyrus dry and unremarkable. The inked lines faded to the soft brown of age. The handwriting was neat but plain, the contents seemingly dull, grain tallies, shipping manifests, lists of mundane transactions. To an untrained reader, they were the kind of records destined for the library's lesser shelves. But the keepers knew to look closer. A certain tension in the fibres, a faint unevenness in the ink, a curious spacing between the lines. These were the quiet signs of a different kind of message. The words that mattered were not the ones in view. They slept in the papyrus, waiting for the right hand to wake them. The awakening was done by light or by breath. Some scrolls revealed their hidden text when held under direct sunlight, the heat coaxing out faint letters in a pigment invisible under ordinary conditions. Others responded to the moisture of a warm exhale, as if the reader's breath were whispering permission for the words to appear. In either case, the transformation was brief. A pale script blooming across the surface before fading again, like a tide withdrawing from sand. The messages themselves were rarely short. They detailed far more than the location of hidden treasures or the movement of a single caravan. One described an entire network of trade routes unknown to official records, weaving through deserts, over mountain passes, and across rivers marked on no public map. Another contained a ledger of bribes paid to high-ranking officials in 3 separate kingdoms, each payment disguised in the visible text as an offering for temple maintenance. Most dangerous of all were the accounts of secret alliances, sworn agreements between rival powers to coordinate their wars, manipulate grain prices, or arrange assassinations disguised as accidents. These were not the myths or conjectures of gossiping merchants. The names, dates, and locations were precise. Cross-referenced against the library's public records, they aligned with events that had baffled historians for decades. The keepers debated endlessly over the origins of these scrolls. Were they intercepted communications, smuggled into the library by agents who understood their value? Or had they been deposited deliberately by someone who wanted them hidden in plain sight, trusting that only those with the skill to uncover them would ever read them? Regardless of their source, the scrolls were treated as a kind of weapon. The knowledge within them could be used to bring down kings, dismantle empires, or redraw the boundaries of trade itself. Even within the vault, they were kept in separate compartments, so that no one reader could easily assemble the entire web of intrigue. The more sensitive scrolls were given false catalogue entries, their supposed content reduced to meaningless labels like Harvest Records, Island District, or Port Customs Year 6 of Ptolemy III. The techniques used to write them were as varied as their content. Some inks were made from rare plants whose chemical properties shifted under heat. Others contained ground minerals that reflected light only at certain angles. A few combined both methods, making them all but impossible to decode without the correct process. These methods were known in fragments to the keepers, who guarded them as fiercely as the messages themselves. It was not unusual for a newly appointed keeper to be tested with one of these scrolls, handed over without instruction. The test was not to read it, that could be shown in time, but to recognize that it was more than it appeared. Those who failed might pass it over without a second thought, adding it to the open archives where anyone could stumble upon it. Those who succeeded became part of the inner circle, who knew just how many of the library's ordinary records were anything but. On rare occasions, one of these coded scrolls was brought into the light of necessity. A famine threatening Alexandria might be traced to a deliberate blockade arranged in secret. An impending war might be prevented by revealing an unpublicized treaty between rival generals. Yet these interventions were always indirect. A whispered warning to a merchant, an anonymous tip to a city official, never an open declaration that the library itself held such knowledge. The danger was not only in what the scrolls contained, but in the fact that they existed at all. Should it become known that the library was a repository of state secrets, its neutrality would be shattered. Armies might march not to burn it, but to claim it. And in some ways, that would be worse. And so the keepers preserved the coded scrolls with the same paradoxical care they gave to all dangerous knowledge, hidden, protected, and never entirely forgotten. When the sunlight fell just right across the sealed compartments of the vault, it was tempting to imagine the letters stirring faintly in the dark, restless to be read. For the keepers, that temptation was part of the oath, the knowledge that some truths could topple dynasties, and that the surest way to guard them was to let them sleep, like patterns in the sand that vanish with the next tide. It was a slender scroll, unremarkable in size, yet heavier than its weight suggested, as though the ink itself carried some invisible density. The papyrus gave off a faint aroma that mingled sweetness with something metallic. Myrrh, yes, but also the unmistakable tang of lead. That scent seemed to cling to the fingers of anyone who handled it, as if the act of unrolling it left some trace that water could not entirely wash away. The keepers called it the alchemist's dream, though no title appeared anywhere in its neat curling script. Its author, unnamed, began not with the common tricks of lesser alchemists, no cheap recipes for gilding copper or counterfeit coins, but with a claim so audacious that even the most seasoned reader paused before reading further. It spoke plainly of transmutation, not in the guarded, symbolic language of allegory, but as a process that could, in the right hands, transform base metals into pure gold. Yet almost at once it became clear that this was no mere manual of metallurgy. The scroll wove its instructions between meditations on the nature of change itself, suggesting that the physical transformation of matter was only a mirror of a deeper transformation, the refinement of the human soul. As lead is heavy and unyielding, one passage read, so is the spirit before it learns its true nature. To strip away the dross from gold is to strip away ignorance from the self. The instructions, though scattered and cryptic, were precise enough to trouble the keepers. They described vessels of clay, glazed with certain minerals, furnaces kept at exact temperatures for days without interruption, powders and tinctures mixed in ratios that implied a knowledge of chemistry far beyond what was thought possible. In the margins, tiny diagrams showed the gradual shifting of colours in the crucible, from dull grey to bright white, then to a deep red, and finally to the warm, unyielding glow of gold. Some believed it was allegory, that the gold was symbolic, the furnace or a metaphor for discipline, and the final product a mind purified by patience and self-examination. Others feared it was literal, for the combination of substances described, though incomplete, suggested that the author had discovered principles unknown to even the most skilled artisans of Alexandria. If the process worked, even partially, the implications were vast. In the wrong hands, it could flood a market with counterfeit wealth, collapse economies, or draw the attention of rulers greedy for endless gold. In the right hands, it could enrich the city beyond imagining. But perhaps the most dangerous element was neither the gold nor the method, but the hope it inspired. Gold, after all, was not just currency, it was the measure of power, the lure of immortality in the form of enduring wealth. And here was a scroll that seemed to promise it could be made from almost nothing, given the right knowledge and patience. Even those who doubted its claims found themselves wondering, what if? And hope, the keepers knew, was often the most corrosive force of all. The scroll's origins were debated in hushed tones. One theory claimed it had come from the workshops of an Egyptian priest-engineer who served in the reign of Nectanebo II, smuggled away during the Persian conquest. Another suggested it was copied from a text brought by caravans from the Far East, where metallurgical traditions were older still. A few whispered it was the work of an alchemist who had succeeded in both transformations, turning metal to gold and himself into something other. Whatever its history, the alchemist's dream was handled with more ceremony than most of the vault's treasures. The keeper assigned to guard it was required to seal it in a lead-lined case after each viewing, both to preserve its scent and, though none said it aloud, to keep whatever power it contained from leaking into the air. Only a handful of scholars were ever permitted to examine it, and then only under close supervision, with their own notes inspected afterward for any hint of copied formulae. Over time, stories gathered around the scroll. One told of a visiting mathematician who studied it for an afternoon, then returned home to sell all his possessions and vanish into the desert with a single clay vessel and a bag of coal. Another spoke of a court physician who claimed to have used one of its lesser recipes to cure the melancholy of a nobleman, a cure that left the man restless and strange, as if some part of him had been burned away. The keepers, pragmatic as always, did not trouble themselves with whether the scroll's claims were true in the physical sense. They knew its greater danger lay in the longing it stirred. To those who read it, the idea of transformation, whether of metal, of spirit, or of fate itself, became irresistible. And longing could drive men to attempt what reason told them was impossible. For now, the alchemist's dream sleeps in its lead-lined case, the scent of myrrh and lead locked within. Those who have unrolled it say that even after years, the ink seems fresh, as though the words are still alive, waiting for someone with the courage or the folly to follow them to their end. And perhaps, in the flicker of lamplight in the vault, the gold described within has already been made, not in the crucible, but in the mind of whoever dares to believe. They were not written on fine papyrus meant to last the centuries, but on rough sheets, hurriedly inked, their margins crowded with revisions and additions. The handwriting was varied, some steady and elegant, others jagged, as if penned in a rush. Yet despite their humble appearance, the scripts carried a weight far heavier than their pages. The keepers called them the Theatre of Shadows, for they were plays meant never to be seen under the open sky. These works were not tragedies in the Athenian style, nor light comedies for the marketplace. They were something sharper, aimed directly at the ruling powers of their time. The characters wore the thin disguises of allegory, a king as a lion, a high priest as a serpent, a governor as a crow picking at carrion. But the citizens of Alexandria, had they seen them, would have recognized the targets instantly. The plays exposed corruption in the temple courts, greed in the royal treasury, cowardice in the council chambers. And because truth spoken plainly could invite swift punishment, the playwrights hid their messages in metaphor, though the metaphors were so keen that no ruler could mistake them. The origins of the scripts were scattered. One was traced to a Greek poet who vanished after his work was banned in Athens. Another came from an Egyptian dramatist whose family, according to rumour, was exiled after a private reading of his play in Memphis. Still others arrived anonymously, smuggled in with crates of amphorae or sewn into the lining of traders' garments. The keepers suspected that some of these works were written in Alexandria itself, under false foreign names, to shield their authors from recognition. A few scripts bore notations in the margins about staging, curtain of black cloth, actors masked entirely, no more than 20 spectators. These were signs of performances held in hidden rooms, with small trusted audiences. The plays were never meant for the wide steps of the theatre, but for whispered gatherings where each word could be weighed and each metaphor savoured for its sting. The language of the Theatre of Shadows was its own craft. The plays were layered so that an unthinking listener might hear only an odd fable about animals or spirits, but an attentive one would hear a trial of the city's most powerful. One script told of a shepherd who locked his flock inside the pen and then blamed the wolves for their hunger. Another told of a high priest who sold blessings to the highest bidder, all the while preaching poverty from the temple steps. Even in their secrecy, the plays were dangerous. A servant overhearing a rehearsal, a merchant glimpsing a page of dialogue, could be enough to unravel a company of actors and lead to arrests. The keepers believed this was why so many of the scripts had no endings. The lines simply stopped. the ink fading mid-thought. Whether the playwrights had been silenced before they could finish, or had chosen to leave the works incomplete to protect themselves, no one could say. When the first of these scripts came into the library's possession, the keepers debated whether to destroy it. But as with so many other dangerous works, destruction was against their deepest principles. Instead, they sealed the scripts in the innermost vault, stored in boxes lined with cedar to keep insects from gnawing the papyrus. Each was labelled only with a number, not a title, so that even the index gave no hint of their content, and yet from time to time a keeper would take one from its box and read it aloud in the dim light of the vault. The words, though written for audiences long gone, still burned with immediacy. One could hear in them the pulse of defiance, the laughter that rises from seeing power unmasked, the sharp intake of breath when a truth long felt but never spoken is finally put into words. Some keepers wondered what might happen if these plays were performed again, not in the courts of Alexandria, but in some far-off city, centuries hence, where their metaphors might slip past the notice of censors. Others feared that, even after ages, the works would still be dangerous, for the flaws of power they described were not bound to a single age or ruler. The theatre of shadows remains in darkness, its scripts unread for years at a time. Yet the words wait, patient as always. Paper may fade, ink may crumble, but a story, once told, never truly sleeps. Somewhere in the silence of the vault, the voices of these unseen actors still murmur, ready to step from the shadows, whenever the world dares to let them speak again. It was unlike any star chart the keepers had ever seen. Most maps of the heavens in Alexandria began with the familiar, Orion striding across the winter sky, the steadfast North Star anchoring the horizon, the constellations of the ecliptic marching along their well-trodden path. But this manuscript opened with neither Orion nor Polaris. In fact, the skies it depicted seemed to begin where the northern world's vision ended. The parchment was tinted a faint ochre, as though it had been brushed with diluted clay before the ink was laid upon it. The stars were rendered not as neat, uniform dots, but as tiny silvered pinpricks that caught and reflected the lamplight. Lines drawn between them formed shapes no Alexandrian navigator would recognize. A great bird with wings outstretched, a coiled serpent whose body curved through a sweep of stars invisible from the Mediterranean, and a ring of bright points encircling a single dark space, a crown with an empty throne at its centre. The manuscript had come, according to a brief note in the library's private register, from a merchant fleet returning from lands below the crossing of the sun, a vague phrase suggesting voyages deep into the southern oceans. Among their trade goods was a rolled packet sealed in hardened beeswax, entrusted to them by a coastal people who claimed it was the work of their sky singers, navigators who memorized the heavens not from fixed charts, but from the changing songs of the seasons. To the keepers, it was immediately apparent that this map was no imitation. The positions of the stars, once compared to known astronomical tables, revealed that the manuscript captured a view of the heavens entirely hidden from the latitude of Alexandria. The so-called Garden of Unnamed Stars spread across its surface in patterns that could only be seen far to the south, where the Earth's curve lifted a different dome of night into view. To navigate by these constellations, the text explained, was to sail along ocean paths known only to those who lived beyond the equator. The bird with wings outstretched marked a seasonal wind that carried ships across vast distances. The serpent wound its way above a current that flowed warm and strong beneath the stars. The crown was said to guide sailors toward an island that existed only in one half of the year, vanishing beneath storms in the other. There were other details that startled the keepers. The manuscript did not depict the stars in isolation. The spaces between them were painted with faint, translucent washes of blue, green and red, suggesting the Milky Way and other deep sky phenomena as they might appear to eyes well accustomed to darkness. It seemed to imply that the heavens were not merely points to steer by, but a living landscape, one in which the stars were the flowers of an immense eternal garden. The margins of the parchment were filled with notes in the same flowing hand, written in a language unfamiliar to the majority of the keepers. After weeks of quiet work, they were able to translate fragments, invocations to the southern wind, warnings about false stars that appeared during certain storms, and instructions for finding the path of the moon's shadow, a phrase that suggested foreknowledge of eclipses in those distant latitudes. To Alexandrian scholars trained in the northern tradition, the existence of such precise and complex southern navigation was both exhilarating and troubling. If true, it meant that great oceanic voyages had been undertaken by cultures beyond the reach of Mediterranean maps, linking lands that the city's own geographers had never imagined. It also meant that the supposed limits of the known world were not limits at all, but merely the edges of one civilization's sight. The keepers debated whether the chart should be shared with the library's wider scholarly community. On one hand, it could inspire new voyages and expand the horizons of knowledge. On the other, revealing it could invite exploitation. Fleets sent to claim the lands under those stars before their people could defend them. Trade routes seized, cultures disrupted. In the end, they chose secrecy. The manuscript was stored in a shallow cedar drawer in the vault, beneath a pane of glass polished so finely it seemed invisible. When viewed under lamplight, the silver stars glimmered as though they were truly suspended in the blackness of space. A few keepers standing over it in the quiet hours of night admitted to feeling as though they were looking through a window into another sky, one that called to them with the same pull as the sea calls to sailors. It became a quiet tradition among certain keepers to refer to the manuscript by its true gift, not its scholarly label, the Garden of Unnamed Stars. For in its shapes and patterns was a reminder that the universe was far wider than even Alexandria's great library could contain, and that there were still corners of the world and the sky untouched by the reach of its shelves. And perhaps somewhere far to the south, under that other dome of night, a navigator stood looking north, holding a chart of their own, one filled with constellations we would not know, and with an empty space where the garden bloomed unseen. It lay alone, in a small alcove deep within the vault, a space just large enough for a single reading table and one lamp whose light could be softened to a warm, steady glow. The keepers called it the uncopyable scroll, though whether that name described a curse, a craft, or a quirk of nature, no one had ever decided. It was not large, and at first glance it seemed no different from countless other papyrus rolls preserved in the library, but those who had worked with it knew better. The scroll's papyrus was a pale grey, its surface unusually smooth, almost waxen to the touch. The ink, though dark and sharply legible, had a faint iridescence, catching light like oil on water. Even under the library's careful preservation, the scroll had always been fragile. A breath too close seemed enough to lift one of its fibres, and it was never unrolled more than halfway, for fear of splitting it along the seam. Its content was a marvel in itself, a treatise on the movement of water through underground channels, interwoven with precise observations of springs, wells and rivers across lands both known and unknown. The author, unnamed, though the phrasing suggested a scholar of both engineering and philosophy, had recorded techniques for locating hidden sources of fresh water in deserts, methods for diverting streams without harming their ecosystems, and designs for reservoirs that could last centuries. Such knowledge could have transformed the fortunes of whole regions, but it was knowledge that resisted being shared. The first attempt to copy it centuries earlier had seemed successful enough. A skilled scribe, chosen for his steady hand, spent 3 weeks producing an exact replica, his ink strokes so precise that the two versions were indistinguishable. Yet when the copy was examined a fortnight later, its writing had grown pale, as if exposed to decades of sunlight, until at last Nothing remained but faint impressions of the pen. Thinking it an accident of materials, the keepers tried again. This time, they used a different ink, one richer in carbon, known to last generations without fading. The copy held for 12 days before its letters began to blur, then flake away entirely. Even attempts to copy the text into wax tablets failed. The carved grooves in the wax softened and vanished, as though the marks themselves were being erased by some unseen hand. Over the centuries, other methods were attempted. Impressions in damp clay, etched silver sheets, even verbal dictation to a second scribe who had never seen the original, all met the same end. Within days or weeks the words were gone, leaving only blank material behind. Curiously, the copyists themselves retained no memory of the text. When asked to recall a single phrase, they would falter, frown, and admit that it was like trying to remember a dream upon waking. They could recall the feeling of reading it, the beauty of its phrasing, but not the words themselves. This uncanny resistance to reproduction led to whispers that the scroll was cursed. Some claim the author had imbued it with protective magic to prevent its knowledge from being stolen. Others believed it was crafted from a plant whose fibers naturally rejected any attempt at duplication. A few ventured that it was not the scroll itself, but the ideas within, that refused to be trapped twice, that the concepts were alive in some way, unwilling to dwell in more than one vessel at a time. For this reason, the keepers kept the scroll in complete isolation. Only one person at a time was ever permitted to read it, and even then only under close supervision. No writing instruments were allowed in the alcove. The reader was permitted only to observe, to memorize, and to leave. Whether they retained the knowledge depended on something the keepers could not explain. A few emerged able to recite sections verbatim years later, while others forgot everything within a day. Those who did remember often described a peculiar sensation while reading. They spoke of feeling as though the words were being placed into their minds rather than taken in through the eyes. Some reported faint sounds, like trickling water, while they read. One described it as a voice speaking not to my ears, but to the part of me that dreams. Over time, the keepers ceased trying to duplicate the scroll. Its nature, whether magical, material, or psychological, made such attempts fruitless. Instead, they preserved it as best they could, rolling it only halfway to reduce strain, keeping it in a cedar-lined case with just enough ventilation to prevent decay. To open it was to risk it, and so it was opened rarely, sometimes decades apart. The question of why it resisted copying was never answered, but among the keepers there grew a quiet respect for the idea that perhaps it was meant to exist in this way, not as a thing to be spread across the world, but as a singular object, its knowledge a rare and fleeting gift for those who encountered it. In this way, it was as much a riddle as it was a record, a lesson in the impermanence of possession, the fragility of holding something in the mind, and so it rests still, in its solitary alcove, untouched by ink or stylus, as though it were an island in a great sea of words, a place one might visit for a moment, but never claim. In the silence of the vault, it seems to wait patiently, as if it knows that no matter how many centuries pass, there will always be someone willing to risk forgetting everything, just for the chance to understand. It was shelved in the vault beneath an innocuous label, seasonal records of the upper provinces, a deliberate misdirection for a work that had nothing to do with planting schedules or the rise and fall of riverbanks. The scroll itself was old, but not ancient, its papyrus darkened only slightly by time, its ink still sharp against the fibres. It was the words, not the material, that gave it weight. The keepers called it the Chronicle of Coming Ashes. In its measured, almost detached prose, it described a series of events as if they had already happened. The torching of a great harbour city, the choking of a river until fish floated belly up on its surface, the fall of a ruler whose throne was seized not by his enemies, but by his own blood. Each entry was precise in its sequence, naming the season, the direction from which certain winds would blow, and, in some cases, the very day when the event would turn from shadow to flame. What unsettled the keepers most was that some of these events had already come to pass, exactly as written, though the scroll was older than the events themselves. The burning of a coastal settlement to the east, long attributed to raiders, was here described in detail years before it happened, down to the unusual red banners carried by the attackers. A drought that withered fields and drove villages to ruin was foretold alongside the exact number of days the rains would fail. The deposition of a powerful satrap, whispered to have been orchestrated in the shadows, matched precisely the chronicle's account. The method, the moment, the betrayal within his own household. The question that divided the keepers was simple. How? Was this a work of prophecy, the product of divine vision, or supernatural insight? Or was it something else, a document born from calculation, so meticulous, from knowledge of human ambition and natural cycles so deep that the future became almost inevitable? 1. Theory held that the chronicle's author was not a seer, but a master of observation. By reading the signs others ignored, the patterns of drought, the tensions in trade routes, the ambitions of rival courts, they had been able to anticipate outcomes with unnerving accuracy. Another theory suggested a network of informants stretching across continents, feeding the author knowledge of plots and weather alike. The predictions, then, were not supernatural, but the final strokes in a map already charted. Yet there were passages that resisted such tidy explanations. One entry described a black rain falling upon a city whose name was not given, leaving its streets slick with something heavier than water. Another spoke of the silent fields where even the locusts starve, and 3 nights in which the moon hides her face entirely. These events, if they were to come, had not yet done so, and perhaps that was the greater danger, not the events that had already unfolded, but those still waiting. The rulers of Alexandria, had they known of the chronicle, would have seen it as a direct threat to their power. Authority rested not only on control of the present, but on mastery of the future, or at least the illusion of it. If a document could strip away that illusion, predicting the fall of a leader before he himself sensed it, then it could undo the delicate balance of fear and loyalty that held kingdoms together. For this reason, the keepers locked it away as soon as it arrived. It had come to them in the possession of a merchant captain, traded for a cask of wine and safe harbour after a storm. The captain claimed to have found it in the wreckage of another vessel, clutched in the hands of a dead man lashed to the mast. That man's face, the captain swore, was marked with strange burns, as if from sparks or ash. The chronicle was read only in the vault's innermost chamber, and then only by the most senior of the keepers. Each reading was followed by an uneasy silence, for to know the future, or to think one knew it, was to be changed by it. The keepers understood the temptation to act on such knowledge, to nudge events toward or away from their written outcome. But they also understood the danger. To act might be to bring about the very thing one sought to prevent. And so it remained, consulted only rarely, usually when the city trembled on the edge of uncertainty. Even then, its words were weighed with suspicion, for no one could say whether they were glimpses of an unchangeable fate or just the artful predictions of a mind long gone. In the quiet of the vault, the chronicle lies rolled in its false-titled case, its ink waiting in darkness. Somewhere in its lines, there are fires yet to burn, rivers yet to dry, rulers yet to fall. And whether these things will come to pass because they are written, or whether they are written because they will come to pass, no keeper has dared to decide. It occupied a shallow drawer near the floor, as if the keepers had decided instinctively that anything capable of exhaling should be stored low, close to the earth. The papyrus itself looked ordinary enough when the drawer slid open. Pale, faintly ribbed, its edges clean, where countless careful hands had trimmed away fray. But the moment it was unrolled, slowly, over the felted surface of the table, the room seemed to grow smaller by a breath, the air to gather and then release. And there it was, a sound no louder than silk moving against silk. Some heard a sigh, others a half-swallowed word. A few insisted that it was the hush of wind entering a long, deserted house. The first time a new keeper encountered it, he laughed, ashamed of the quick shiver on his arms. The second time, the laugh didn't come. The third, he glanced behind him to be sure the door was shut. There was nothing in the script to account for it. The characters were crisp and unremarkable, written in a common hand with the measured spacing of a trained scribe. The text appeared to be a devotional poem of no special force, invocations to a household god, a few lines about the turning seasons, moral maxims fit for the walls of any respectable shop. And yet the drawer was marked with a small bronze sigil that meant handle only with another present. Not for danger of content, but for what the papyrus did to the room and to the people in it. The keepers had performed their experiments, as keepers will. They tested for drafts, for the subtle rush of air that comes when a coil of papyrus is eased open. They measured pressure, temperature, the position of the lamp's flame. They rolled it out quickly, rolled it out slowly, unrolled it halfway, then a finger's width more, then a finger's width less. They tried in the dry month when dust rides the light, and during the damp wind that comes with early spring. The sound persisted. It changed with no measurable variable, and yet it was always there, small as the first idea before it finds a word. One keeper, with a talent for devices, built a frame to hold the papyrus in a gentle tension, so that no air could be pressed from its coils. Another placed dampened cloths around the edges to muffle any whispering friction. A third, more superstitious than he admitted, burned grains of frankincense and said a quick prayer under his breath. The papyrus answered them all the same way, with a breath that did not belong to anyone in the room. To call it a voice would be to give it too much shape, but neither was it merely noise. Those present agreed that the sound carried an intimation of structure, as if the rise and fall of it belonged to speech without syllables, meaning without vocabulary. Afterward, when they compared notes, their descriptions diverged. It asked a question, one wrote. No, said another. It was an apology. A third claimed he had heard a shoreline, the long even inhalation of a tide. The more rational scholars, insulted by the rebellion of their senses, declared it a trick of expectation. Once told to listen, for a whisper the mind obliges. But even they, crossing the threshold to return the papyrus to its drawer, found themselves glancing back, as if the page might call after them. There were theories. Of course there were. Some said the papyrus fibres trapped pockets of air that, when released, sang along their own faint corrugations, like a reed flute too small for the eye to recognise. Others postulated that the ink, mixed with resinous binders, became minutely adhesive with age. When the coils parted, they parted reluctantly, murmuring their complaint. The least mystical explanation was always favoured in conversation near the catalogue tables. The more mystical ones were kept for the walk home along the colonnade, when the lamps threw patient circles on the floor and the great building seemed to breathe on its own. No theory explained why the sound changed when the text was read aloud. On those rare occasions when a keeper, against custom, spoke the lines while the page lay open, the whisper altered, grew softer, or moved toward a different register, like a listener leaning closer. Twice in the ledgers there appears a notation of something that the scribes, with their commitment to restraint, labelled correspondence. In both cases the reader paused uncertain, because the rustle arrived precisely on the beat between words. Not during motion, not when air moved across the page, but at the seam of silence between lines. It felt like an answer. That is how the note records it, as if answered. The text itself, as stated, was nothing incendiary, but in the margins, faint and fainter still, There were marks whose purpose no one could agree upon. A dot above certain invocations, a tiny curved stroke beside a line about the planting of onions, a barely discernible diagonal where the scribe had copied a proverb on the danger of keeping secrets. Under oblique light, these marks took on the sheen of something laid down after the main hand had dried. Not corrections, not gloss, more like the impressions of a finger wet with clear sap. When traced across the whole, they formed a pattern only visible to those who had the patience to chart them. That pattern, mapped once by a sleepless keeper, with more devotion than sense, resembled the rising and falling of a voice, pauses, emphases, a breathing shape. It is possible, one keeper argued, that the papyrus had been used in ritual, repeatedly rolled and unrolled in the presence of a chanting congregation until the act of opening became a liturgy. The breath we hear, he suggested, is simply the shape of that memory. The papyrus remembers. Another keeper, whose wife had died that winter, said softly that the mind, when it wants a thing to be alive, will give it lungs. No one challenged him. A story clings to the whispering papyrus, as stories cling to anything that refuses to be contained. Inside explanation. It tells of a physician scholar who had lost a child to fever and came to the vault on a day of sharp wind. He asked to read the devotional, though he did not call it that. He called it, with the impatience of grief, the one that breathes. The keepers, understanding that rule is sometimes the niece of mercy, allowed it. He unrolled the page, the sigh came, he bowed his head. After a long time, he said, "It asked where I had put the shoes," and laughed once, startled and almost cruel to himself. When he left, he returned the papyrus with hands that no longer trembled. The keepers did not record such things as evidence. They recorded them as weather. It was cold, it was windy. A man heard what he needed. Because of its effect on the senses, the papyrus was subject to stricter handling than most. Two keepers in the room, a lamp with a hood to soften flame flicker. A moving light made the whisper seem to shift. No reading after midnight, not for reasons of superstition, the head archivist insisted, but because the ear, at that hour, corrupts the truth. A narrow strip of linen lay in the drawer to cushion the first turn, and a strand of silk tied to the papyrus's leading edge allowed the closing to be done without the scrape of nail on fibre. Even these measures took on their own ritual feel, and more than one apprentice, assigned to watch, found himself holding his breath to avoid adding his own sound to the room. Over time, a curious practice arose when a keeper needed to test his own certainty about a judgment, a secrecy, a choice that would alter an inventory or a life. He petitioned to sit with the whispering papyrus. The rules allowed no question to be posed, no divination attempted. He would simply open the page, allow the breath to gather and release, and attend to the thoughts that rose in the hush that followed. If superstition lurked at the edge of this habit, it was a superstition with its claws sheathed. Not that the papyrus spoke, but that it made room for a listener. There were, inevitably, those who feared it. One senior scribe refused to enter the alcove after the whisper brushed his ear, in a way he later described, and then regretted describing, as intimate. A visiting mathematician accused the library of indulging charlatanry and stormed away, only to return the next day with an apology and a theory involving elastic recoil and microscopic ridges. The papyrus accepted both with the same small breath. As for its origin, the trail did what trails do when they lead past the edge of a map. A notation suggested it had come from a temple storehouse in the delta, traded for glassware and physicians' salves. Another hinted at a desert monastery, where the brothers copied prayers onto leaves stripped from the inner bark of a rare plant, claiming the plant itself listened. None of it could be verified. The only incontestable truth was the sound itself, and even that changed in the telling. A he, sigh. A word, a si. And perhaps that was the lesson the keepers ended by taking from it. That some objects enter our keeping, not to be solved, but to be kept cared for, guarded from harm, allowed to continue being precisely the kind of riddle that refines the ear that hears it. When the papyrus was rolled closed, the room seemed to return to its ordinary size. The lamplight spread itself out again. Footsteps resumed their natural noise. But for a moment, and sometimes for an hour, the sense lingered that the air had learned a language and then politely forgotten it. So the whispering papyrus sleeps, low to the ground in its shallow drawer. It will be opened again, not often because ore spoils quickly when handled, and it will breathe, and those present will add their small mortal breaths to the tally that accompanies all human stewardship. Whether it is a trick of matter or a memory made audible, the keepers do not decide. They listen, they close the drawer, they carry the key away. It rested in a narrow cedar box, lined with silk the colour of deep wine, as though, even in silence, it deserved a setting fit for royalty. The seal, red wax impressed with a crest of interlocking vines, remained intact, unbroken through all the centuries since it was pressed. That, in itself, was unusual. Most correspondence in the vault had been opened long ago, catalogued and read. But this letter had never been delivered, never received, and by the unspoken agreement of the keepers, never broken. The outer address was written in a hand both graceful and firm, to His Majesty, Sovereign of the Western Isles. The name was absent, though the period in which it was penned narrowed the possibilities to a single ruler, a king whose reign had been marked by both ambitious expansion and sudden, unexplained concessions. Across the top, in a smaller hand, perhaps that of a court scribe, was a notation, "By the hand of Her Grace, Queen of the Eastern Shores." It had come into the library's possession through a chain of quiet exchanges. The first record places it in the belongings of a merchant family in Alexandria, who claimed it had been given to them by a ship's captain as payment for debts. The captain, in turn, said it had been entrusted to him by a lady-in-waiting who had fled the Queen's court in haste, fearing for her life. How the letter made its way from the royal writing table to that servant's keeping was a question no one could answer. The keepers had debated for years whether the seal should be broken. On one side, it was a historical document, potentially rich in diplomatic significance. On the other, the intact seal was part of its mystery, and perhaps its integrity. In the end, the vote had gone narrowly in favour of preservation without opening, the decision resting on a principle as old as the library itself. Some words were written for a single set of eyes, and if those eyes had never seen them, perhaps that too was part of their story. Even without reading it, the keepers pieced together hints of its contents from the circumstances surrounding its creation. The date of the seal coincided with a moment of tense negotiation between the Queen's realm and the Western Isles, a time when warships had gathered like storm clouds, only to disperse without battle. Shortly afterward, the king abandoned a long-sought alliance with another power, a decision that puzzled his own court. The prevailing theory among the keepers was that the letter contained an offer, an alliance bound not only by politics, but by personal sentiment. Rumours in the Queen's court, preserved in the writings of a visiting ambassador, hinted at a bond between the two rulers that went beyond formal diplomacy. If the letter spoke of such a connection, it might explain the king's sudden shift in policy, even without it ever reaching his hands. The mere knowledge that it existed, passed quietly through intermediaries, could have been enough to influence decisions on both sides of the sea. There were darker possibilities too. Some believed the letter contained accusations of betrayal within the Queen's own circle, charges aimed at ministers, generals, perhaps even her consort. If so, delivering it might have destabilised her court or provoked the very conflict she sought to avoid. In that light, its undelivered state could be seen not as a failure, but as a deliberate act of caution. The object itself bore traces of the hand that had created it. The paper was thick and fine, its edges gilded so faintly that they caught the lamplight when tilted. The wax seal had been pressed before the wax fully cooled, leaving the crest slightly blurred, as though the sender had been in haste or distracted. A faint trace of perfume lingered in the fibres, not the heavy oils of ceremonial occasions, but something lighter, with notes of citrus and cedar, as if chosen for intimacy rather than display. From time to time, a keeper would take the cedar box from its shelf and set it on the reading table, not to open it, but simply to look at it. The weight of it in the hand was strangely persuasive, as though, even sealed, it wanted to be read. And yet there was also a sense of quiet finality, a recognition that whatever was written inside belonged to a conversation that never happened, a path never taken. There is a certain power in an unsent letter. Its words are frozen at the moment of their creation, untouched by the interpretations, arguments, and replies that might have followed. It exists in a pure state, a single voice speaking into a silence that never answers. For the keepers, that made it a kind of relic, not just of two rulers and their time, but of a possibility that history chose to set aside. Now it sleeps among the vault's other secrets, the wax still whole, the silk still smooth beneath it. Perhaps one day a hand will break the seal, and the words inside will spill into the world at last, or perhaps it will remain forever closed, its message carried only by the weight of its absence, a reminder that not all history is made of what is said, but of what is withheld. It began without ceremony. No single day is marked in the library's own ledgers as the day its breath caught in its throat. The archives do not note the exact hour when the hush of the reading rooms changed from reverent to uneasy. Yet in later years, when the survivors spoke of it, they described it as if a great pulse had faltered, a silence not of rest but of something ending. The great hall still stood, its colonnades white in the afternoon light, the scent of papyrus and cedar lingering in the air. Scholars still moved between the shelves, but there was an undercurrent, a sense that something was missing. A few whispered that certain vault keys no longer hung on their pegs. Others noticed absences in the catalogue, entries with titles but no locations, as though the shelves they once occupied had been erased. The truth was not singular. It was not one act of destruction, but a long, stuttering unravelling. There were fires, yes, one sparked in the harbour during a clash between soldiers, when flaming pitch arced through the air and found the wrong roof. The smoke that rose from the library that day carried with it fragments of words, blackened shreds of scrolls that drifted over the city before dissolving into nothing. People caught them in their hands without knowing what they were holding, a phrase from an ancient poet, a number from a lost calculation, before the wind took them away. But there was also neglect, the quiet ruin that creeps in when vigilance wanes. The keepers, fewer now, could not guard every chamber. Damp crept into the lower vaults during an unusually heavy winter, curling the edges of papyrus, blooming mould between pages. Rats gnawed through boxes. Scrolls that had rested for centuries, untroubled, were suddenly fragile as cobwebs, disintegrating at a touch. And perhaps worst of all, there were deliberate removals, the kind carried out in darkness, with careful hands and no witnesses. Some scrolls did not burn or rot, they simply disappeared. Whether taken by collectors, spirited away by agents of foreign courts, or hidden by the remaining keepers themselves, no one could say. The absence was the same. In the ledgers, a neat line of ink marked relocated, but no destination was recorded. For the forbidden scrolls, the ones locked in the inner vault, the danger had always been twofold, that they might be destroyed, and that they might survive in the wrong hands. As rumours of the library's instability spread, the vault doors were opened more often than in any previous decade. Sometimes it was to rescue what could be carried to safer ground. Other times, it was to take for oneself a prize that could never be openly claimed. A handful of keepers, men and women, who had spent their lives in those marble halls, were said to have vanished during this period, each taking a single scroll with them. No one ever confirmed which works they chose. When the final blow came, it was almost anticlimactic. A series of skirmishes in the city sent soldiers clattering up the steps, their boots trailing sand and ash. They were looking not for knowledge, but for vantage points, barricades, stores of timber for burning. The library's defenders, by a thin line of staff and a few sympathetic citizens, could not stop the intrusion. Fires kindled in the outer chambers. To drive them back leapt too far, drawn upward by the draught of the high windows. By morning, the main hall was a blackened skeleton, its columns scorched, its roof half collapsed. When the smoke cleared, the vaults were choked with ash. Some scrolls had survived, their cases scorched but intact. Others lay in piles of fine grey powder, indistinguishable from one another. In the outer rooms, the great cedar shelves stood empty, their rows gaping like missing teeth. The sound of the place was changed forever. Where once there had been the shuffle of sandals, the whisper of turning pages, the soft scrape of a stylus on parchment, there was only the creak of beams cooling in the sun. Alexandria itself seemed altered. The marketplace was still noisy, the harbour still busy with sails and shouting, but there was a hollowness beneath it all. The scholars who had come from across the known world drifted away, some returning to their homelands, others settling in smaller libraries where the air still smelled of ink instead of smoke. The city's rulers spoke of rebuilding, of copying what remained, but in private they admitted that something irreplaceable had gone. In the quiet rooms that survived, the remaining keepers gathered the fragments, scraps of papyrus, brittle bindings, shards of parchment with half-legible lines. They sealed them in smaller chests, not knowing if the words they preserved were profound revelations or the ends of mundane grocery lists. It no longer mattered. The act of saving them was a kind of defiance, a refusal to let the silence claim everything. The forbidden scrolls that remained were hidden deeper than before, wrapped in layers of linen, tucked into niches behind false walls. Some say a few of the most dangerous works were deliberately destroyed in those last days, not out of fear for their power, but from a grim recognition that the age to understand them was gone. Better, the keepers thought, to let some truths vanish entirely than to see them turned into weapons in an era unfit to wield them. In the years after, Alexandria's streets grew quieter at night. The lighthouse still burned, the market still bustled, but the rhythm had changed. The library had been more than a building. It had been a kind of heartbeat for the city. Without it, there was a slowing, not enough to stop life, but enough that those who had known the old pace could feel the difference. Some claimed that in certain corners of the ruins, you could still smell the faint sweetness of myrrh and cedar, the ghost of the old air. Others swore that, if you stood in the right place at dusk, you could hear the echo of footsteps on marble, the rustle of a page turned in some inner room that no longer existed. Whether these were memories or imaginings didn't matter. In a city once measured by the weight of its words, absence could be as loud as presence. The shelves had fallen silent, and Alexandria, for all its brilliance, would never sound the same again. They did not leave by the front doors. No procession, no public vow. The fragments that escaped the ruin of the library slipped into the world the way dusk enters a room, through seams and cracks, through the quiet attention of those who know where shadows keep their promises. Some went tucked beneath the hems of robes, stitched into the linings of travelling cloaks. Others rode inside amphorae beneath a false layer of oil, or under the lids of spice jars whose scents would overwhelm any casual inspection. A few were memorized, held not as ink, but as pulse and breath, until a safer page could be found. In the first years after the day the shelves fell silent, Alexandria learned a new kind of vigilance. The remaining keepers grew thinner and more deliberate, walking with the gravity of those who carry a weight no one else can see. They met in courtyards, where fountains masked their voices, and exchanged packets no larger than a folded hand. Not all the packets held words. Sometimes a single figure, scratched on a shard of pottery, meant more than a paragraph. Sometimes a ribbon of colour indicated a cipher key hidden somewhere across the sea. They were learning again what the founders of the library had known at the beginning, that a collection is not only a house of shelves, it is a network of hands. From those hands, a diaspora of knowledge set out along routes as old as trade and as new as necessity. A physician's scribe took with him 3 leaves from medicine from the other side of the sea, wrapped in linen and tucked into the false bottom of his chest. He settled in a hill town far from any harbour and copied 2 of the recipes into a church ledger disguised as baptismal lists, 1 entry per child, each dose hidden behind the flourish of a name. In that town, for a generation, fevers broke where they once carried children away. The townspeople said the air had changed. The old man said nothing and mended fishing nets on his stoop. A mathematician, widowed by the fires, travelled north with a caravan of glass. She possessed nothing written, only the memory of the long ratio from a lost treatise, an idea about spirals of growth that appeared in shells, seeds, and city streets. She taught it with pebbles in the dust to any apprentice who asked the right kind of question, letting the curve bloom from their own counting. Years later, a mason in an unfamiliar city laid out a market square whose pathways curved with such subtle logic that the crowds moved as water does, without eddies, without strain. No one knew they were walking inside a thought rescued from ash. Some fragments went east by sea. A sailor who had once served as a porter in the vault carried a copy, half remembered and half sketched, of a diagram from machines of the sky. He could not reproduce its precision. What remained was a gesture of wing and angle, a sense of lift held behind the eyes. In a fishing village where the wind came reliably at dawn, boys built kites with spines of reed and skin of thin cloth. And for a season, there were mornings when the village looked up and felt, in their throats, the unfamiliar tug of wanting to rise. The sailor never called it invention. He called it a story he could not forget properly enough. There were darker survivals too, for knowledge does not choose its bearers any more than the sea chooses its drowned. In a court far inland, a minister obtained, by means not recorded, a sliver of the coded ledgers from codes in the sand. He did not understand the whole, only the method for heating a page with a lamp's rim to coax out hidden script. It was enough. By the time his rivals learned the trick, the ledgers in their own houses had revealed names they would have burned to protect. The minister rose, briefly and brilliantly, and fell just as swiftly to a confession wrung from the same lamp. The technique travelled farther than the man. Lamps, after all, are everywhere. Private collections sprouted in the wake of loss, cultivated by those who had cultivated their fortunes on rarer crops. A widow of the river trade kept a cabinet no visitor saw, its drawers lined with cedar as if to preserve a beloved scent. Inside lay fragments that would not have appeared impressive on a scholar's desk, 3 lines from the philosopher's last letter, a small diagram from the map to nowhere, copied in a child's unsure hand, a prayer from the whispering papyrus rendered in ordinary ink. She read none of them. Each was a memory of a person she had hidden or ferried or fed on a night when the city was loud with soldiers. Years after her death, her grandchildren found the cabinet and mistook the papers for scraps of wrapping saved by a tidy woman. The cedar kept its counsel. Elsewhere, a scholar priest in a mountain monastery recopied a handful of constellations from the garden of unnamed stars onto calfskin with pigments ground from lichens and snowbloom. He wrote in the margin a humility that felt like a prayer. These are the flowers of a sky we do not own. His students sang the patterns as hymns during winter when the wind erased the roads. The hymns travelled on pilgrim lips, altered by altitude and fatigue. And centuries later, shepherd children under a different sky could point to a brightness near the horizon and give it a name that had once been silver on Alexandrian parchment. What survived most faithfully were not always the exact words, but the habits the words had taught, the reflex to test an ink against heat, to read a line both forward and backward, to suspect that an ordinary ledger might carry an extraordinary secret. A certain way of stepping into a room and noticing where the draft would fall on a page, a certain way of closing one's eyes and seeing the proportions of a device rather than the device itself. These too are fragments. Habits travel more easily than papyrus. They live in the body and hide there, waiting for the next crisis, the next quiet. Among the scattered keepers, a custom emerged that was less a system than a vow. Each would choose one thread and hold it against all breaking. One chose lineage and carried with him 3 names from the scroll of 10,000 names, repeating them every morning until they became part of his breath. One chose water and taught a child in every village how to taste soil for springs and map damp, not with ink, but with the memory of their tongue. One chose doubt and made it her office to ask, wherever she settled, whether the gods and rulers were kinder than the stories claimed. In that work, Timaeus of Phaleron's letter lived on, not as quote, but as posture. Occasionally, the shadows brightened. In a coastal market known for its fish and its arguments, a seller wrapped a parcel in a scrap of old parchment. The buyer, a school teacher with a fondness for old bindings, smoothed the scrap and stilled. The faintest diagram showed a circle within a circle, marked with numbers that the teacher recognized as the spine of an eclipse table. He traded the fish for the paper, and for months ate only lentils, while he puzzled the circles back into a method for predicting the moon's shadow. On a spring morning years later, when the sun dimmed exactly as his chalkboard promised, the children shouted, then fell silent, feeling, without knowing, how a lost man atop a lighthouse had once taught the sky to keep appointments. There were losses inside the survivals, of course. The uncopyable scroll seems to have chosen, or been compelled, to end with the vault that sheltered it. No copy in the world keeps its voice, and the inverted codex, if any plates left the city, they have not surfaced, or perhaps they have surfaced and no one has recognized them, because to recognize them would require reading them in the one way almost no one thinks to try. Still, the rumor persisted and grew into something like faith that the forbidden collection did not end so much as disperse. In the centuries that followed, travellers told of an apothecary's shop near a river whose jars were labelled with couplets rather than names, each couplet a gate to a cure if you knew how to recite it. A retired admiral in a port that had never heard of Alexandria paid a sculptor to carve a set of wings against the wall of his garden, not for angels, he insisted, but for machines. A farmer who could not read taught his daughter to count the breaths between lightning and thunder and to mark those numbers against a row of beans kept in a bowl. And when drought came, she saw it 3 days before the priests admitted it. What survived also learned to hide in plainer daylight. Universities with proud stone cloisters kept shelves of approved commentaries, while in their basements, janitors rescued abandoned bundles that smelled faintly of myrrh and salt. Painters wove into their canvases patterns of stars that, when traced, formed routes across currents no map dared draw. Midwives pressed a thumb into ash on a hearthstone and made a circle for luck, the same circle that, in another age, had framed a note about the sun. Not all guardians had titles. A bookseller with a limp and a low opinion of princes kept a ledger of debts whose columns concealed a list of questions to ask any text before trusting it. A sailor, with only 2 substantial memories, his mother's hand and a chart of a southern sky, taught a boy the positions of 3 bright points that would lead him home if clouds took the familiar ones. A tailor stitched a small pocket into the inside hem of a scholar's cloak, and, when asked what it was for, said, "For the paper you aren't supposed to have until you must." If you asked the scattered keepers where the forbidden scrolls are now, they would tell you the plain truth. Some became ash, some became rumour, some became customs so ordinary no one thinks to call them knowledge at all. But they would also say, quietly, without romance, that a text is a verb as much as a noun. It happens between hands, between eyes, between a problem and the person who refuses to look away. In that sense, more survived than any ledger could count. And so the fragments wait, in cedar cabinets and clay jars, in the folds of a travelling cloak, in a melody taught to a child for no reason, except that it is beautiful. They wait in the dark corners of market stalls, in a marginal note mistaken for a fly speck, in a recipe that insists the water must be drawn before dawn. They wait in the minds of those who carry questions like lanterns. The knowledge may not be gone, only waiting, as it always has, for the right moment to be read again. And when that moment comes, the reader will not announce themselves with fanfare or decree. They will simply pause in the right light, feel a curve of old ink under their fingertips, and listen for the faint shift of air that means a page has turned and a city's heartbeat somewhere has remembered its rhythm. It is a strange truth that a place can survive without a single stone of its walls standing, without a roof to hold off rain or a door to open in welcome. Alexandria's library does not live in Alexandria anymore, if it ever truly belonged to that city alone. It lives in the way a child asks why, without fearing the silence that follows. It lives in the way a wanderer, halfway between home and nowhere, pauses to note the pattern of clouds over an unfamiliar shore. It lives in the refusal to let a question go unanswered simply because the answer is difficult or forbidden or too large for the neatness of a scroll. The shelves are gone, but the impulse that built them, the hunger to see the world, not just as it is, but as it might be understood, has found 1,000 new hiding places. Some of them are obvious. Universities with gates that welcome the curious, libraries that now lend more than they lock away. But others are quieter. In a village where the night is long and the wind steals words, an elder leans forward to tell the children a story about a far-off sea, and in the telling slips them a truth the rulers of their land would rather they never learn. In a workshop behind a busy street, a craftsman adjusts the design of a tool, guided not by tradition, but by the small spark of what if. Every question we ask becomes a page in the library that no fire can burn. Each act of listening is the ink that writes it. You carry some of its volumes without knowing it, the half-remembered song your grandmother hummed, which turns out to chart the seasons of planting, the dream you had as a child of a city with bridges like ribs, which echoes the blueprints of an architect who lived 2,000 years ago. The mind is a restless archivist, cataloguing not only what it sees, but also what it imagines, and in that catalogue lies the continuation of Alexandria's work. The forbidden scrolls themselves, if they still exist, may be locked in rooms we will never enter, yet their spirit has already slipped the lock. Somewhere, a poet writes verses that turn cause into effect, past into future, as in the book written backwards. Somewhere, a sailor notices the stars of the south sky, the garden of unnamed stars, and sketches them in the corner of a logbook. Somewhere, a healer experiments with an herb from the far side of the sea, not because she has read the scroll on foreign medicine, but because she carries the same fearless curiosity that once put that scroll on a shelf. This is how the library endures, not as a single place, but as a constellation of moments. A question posed in one age becomes the compass of another. A scrap of knowledge that once required a keeper now hides in the memory of someone who has never heard the name Alexandria, but whose fingers repeat the same careful motion when tracing a map or grinding a pigment. The flame of understanding, that first flame spoken of in the oldest scroll, does not need the temple to burn. It leaps from mind to mind, needing only the fuel of attention. And perhaps it is better this way. A great house of knowledge invites both reverence and destruction. Walls can be pulled down, shelves can be emptied by decree, but when the shelves are in us, when the books are the thoughts we carry and the questions we dare to ask, no conqueror can take them all. We are messy, unreliable custodians. Yes, but we are also too many to silence. The library that lives in us is not neat, nor orderly, nor complete, but it is alive. If you have ever wondered what lies beyond the edge of a map, you have opened its doors. If you have ever held a question in your mind longer than comfort allowed, you have walked its halls. If you have ever taught someone not what to think, but how, you have placed a book on its shelf. And when you close your eyes tonight, drifting towards sleep, you may hear the same soft rustle the keepers once heard in Alexandria. Not of papyrus in the wind, but of ideas moving, shifting, taking root. The whispers are still there, patient, eternal. They pass through us in dreams, in sudden clarity, in the quiet moments when the world feels larger than the street you stand on. They remind us that we are not just inheritors of what was lost, but participants in what is still being found. Every thought, every act of seeking, adds a line to a volume that will never be finished. We are each a page in its unwritten story, and the library, for as long as we keep asking, will never close.